Welcome. This is the introductory preface of video, I'm not sure what you want to call it, for the 350 anthropology class, the cultures of Oceania. This is one of a pair of classes. We have the 340, which is the Hawaii class, excuse me, which specifically looks at the populations on the Hawaiian Islands, past and present. The Oceania class is looking at the populations in the island Pacific. Now, this doesn't include Southeast Asia, for example, Indonesia, the Philippines. It doesn't include Asia, which would be Japan, of course. It doesn't include the Pacific Northwest. So it's not the areas in the entire Pacific Ocean. It's the area that's called Oceania, which pretty much is defined as Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. If we have the time, which I almost never do, it technically also sort of includes Australia because no one's ever figured out where else to put Australia in the package. But basically it's these three areas of the Pacific, and that makes up Oceania. So that's what we're looking at this semester. In that context, we're going to take them sort of, arbitrarily from sort of left to right, I guess, or west to east or whatever. So we're going to look at Melanesia first, then Polynesia, then Micronesia. First off, we're going to have a little discussion. I'm going to spend a couple of times going over this whole issue of how these places have been identified, which has been entirely almost by the outside. How people in these areas have been identified by folks from the outside again, and how this shapes how these worlds are seen now. And one of the side effects of that in a rather odd way is the readings that you've got. So let me go over that first, and we'll go over what you got to do for the class. There's two texts for this book class. The first is actually, well, I'm going to reverse order here. The first would actually be Besnet's looking at Tongan society. Superb, very, very well written, very interesting book, a very easy read, looking at basically the issues of identity in one of the island states in Polynesia in the 21st century. Absolutely fascinating, very, very well done. And I think if nothing else, especially if you're not familiar with Polynesian societies, I think it's a real eye-opener in many ways. The second is Hegel's book, which is really, really old. Sorry about that. But it says something sort of striking that I have yet to find a decent text on Micronesian societies that's more recent. What's really sort of surreal is the books that, for example, they use over UH and for the Micronesian stuff, many of those date from the 1980s, which if you think about it, is that's over 40 years ago. And that says something that we'll get into during this semester is that when you do research in the Pacific, and I'm a Pacific Island specialist, you find that an enormous amount of the material is old, and in many cases really, really old. That's not necessarily bad, as we'll see, but it's been around for a while. There's not much research being done now, and most of it is just completely, it's like throwing a dart. You don't know what you're going to hit. So for many, especially in Micronesia, many of the Micronesian regions, states haven't really been studied at all in any comprehensive fashion. And this is really sort of terrifying because if you think about it, you're making issues on, where a country's going to go, the social and personal issues and dynamics that people have in those areas, especially with things like migration, alcoholism, etc. If you don't have any sort of base information about what the group is and what makes them tick, it's really hard to come up with, potential solutions or mitigations or anything like that. And what you're going to find during the semester is for almost all of those regions, for whether it be especially Melanesia and Micronesia, you really can't find a lot of stuff. If I'm back doing work in New Caledonia or Nueva Caledonia in Melanesia, the Southwest Pacific, there's some new stuff that's come out in the last couple of years from two of the French anthropologists. But most of the research dates from the 60s or early 70s. And a lot of the basic research is actually guys from like Lienhardt, who did his work in 1927. And if you don't read French or German, you're shafted because almost none of the work's in English. And this is true of much of the Pacific. Much of the really good old anthropological research in much of the Micronesian region is in German or in Japanese, especially in German. Why? Because Micronesia was under German and then Japanese control till 1945. So you're not going to find stuff on the way things were back in the day in English, because guess what? They didn't write it in English, assuming anyone wrote anything, which in many cases doesn't exist. By contrast, some areas of Polynesia have, anthropologists falling out of trees. To a certain extent, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Hawaii have had a fair amount of anthropological study, though again, it's really erratic and pretty sloppy. And even if they don't have a lot of anthropological research, they have a lot of documented historical accounts of early periods and times when the Europeans were new, sort of new players, especially in the case of Hawaii. So at least you have a depth of information you can go and look at. But for most of the rest of my Polynesia, we don't have that any more than we do for the other areas. There's been, as far as I'm concerned, no really good systematic study of, say, American Samoa or Samoan society in general. Other than Besnier's work, which is pretty focused. There's been no overarching work on say, Tongan society. There's actually been a fair amount of really good work done on Tahitian society by French anthropologists, but I'm not going to make you read it because it's only in French. They're translated. So what I'm trying to get at is one reason there's not a lot of readings for this class is because a lot of it's either so old that you have to understand the context of it. It's not that it's not valuable, but you have to understand where these guys are coming from. Or it's so specific that it really doesn't, in a class at this level, it's not really useful. And to be honest, much of it really wouldn't be useful even in a grad class. It would only be useful if you're going to be a specific specialist looking at that place. And this is pretty weird because usually in anthropology, as in most disciplines, you can give someone sort of like a textbook about here. Here's a textbook that talks about the different groups in Oceania. Can't do that. There's one or two that are just horrible, and they're, again, about 40 years old, but there's nothing out there. And that says something. If you think about it, it's really significant. Given the fact that Micronesia's been under American control since 1945, given that Hawaii has been under American control since 1899, given that Aotearoa, New Zealand, has been under British control since 1840, I forget whenever the final Maori Wars ended. You're talking about 150, 200 years of European control, and yet you have almost no studies of the people. That says something really pretty scary about the way that they're viewed by the people that are basically, if not controlling them, certainly are managing them. And the fact that even in 2021, you have no decent anthropology of anywhere in Micronesia after, 50, 70 years of American control. Like what? So this class is really sort of different in the fact that we have to use material in different ways because a lot of the stuff that you would expect to see that in other areas you would see. For example, if you Google it, you should see a bunch of sources, especially if you're using Google Scholar. For Micronesian stuff, good luck. If you do find it, most of it you won't be able to read because, trust me, Google Translate doesn't work for crap if you're dealing with, German or Japanese. So in that context, just be aware that the texts you've got are the best that are available. It doesn't mean that the Besnier is really good. The Hazel is actually a very good insight into Micronesian societies. And what I think is rather surreal as we get to Micronesia is the lack of changes in the social issues he's bringing up that were occurring now going on, basically 30 years ago. And that says something pretty telling. So anyways, getting into the grading, which, you guys are all obviously pretty interested in. As with the other courses, what I have is my basic, your basic, the big chunk of your grade will be the critical thinking exercises. These are sequential. I want you to do a critical exercise will be after we've gone through a module or two. So if you want to think about it, in most cases, either a geographic region or a chunk of time. And then what I want you to do is just to look at something in more depth. Now, the purpose of these is to give you the chance to look at something that you find more interesting than Bordner telling you, write a paper on this. In that context, then that means that you have to find something that you want to write a paper on. So I'm not going to give you specific topics to write on for the critical thinking exercises. So for example, in the first part, when we're going through the Euro-American views of the Pacific and say Melanesia, when you come to do your critical thinking exercise, you're going to have to be paying attention during that first chunk of the semester. And if something pops up that you find interesting or something that relates to you, maybe by virtue of your background or folks that you know, or that ties into your major or something that you want to do for your career, then use that as the basis of your critical thinking exercise. Because the critical thinking exercise, the main function is to make you look into more depth into something we're covering real quickly. Because you have to remember, we're going over, there's got to be I'm just guessing, maybe 140 different cultures just in Melanesia. And we're covering that in what, 4 weeks, 3 weeks? So, this is sort of like, touring France in 6 hours. I mean, just, or watching a YouTube on fast forward. So you're going to have to pick something that you see coming up that strikes your fancy. And that's what you want to look at in more depth. And that's your critical thinking exercises. And I've got a template here in the syllabus, which actually says, specifically what I'm looking for. So you've got the how to. What they're going to be about, that's your coolio, not mine. I will give you help if you're completely lost, or but I will not tell you what to write. You've got to actually do that, because you'll do a better job for something that you have some interest in. We're going to do a presentation blog in this class. I'm toying with us doing the Pololo project. So I might in the next week or so give you that as an option. But right for now, just because we're not sure how that's playing out, let's go with the presentation blog post, because the Pololo project is a little bit of a stretch for a Pacific Island class. It's a logical one for some of the other classes. This class, it's sort of sketchy. So the blog is basically, again, think of it as, I would suggest, is take one of your critical thinking studies that you've done and expand that even further. The function of the presentation blog post is basically you're presenting stuff for other people to consume. You don't have to actually post it, but that's the intent. So it can either be, for example, a set of slides, PowerPoints, whatever you want to call them, or it can be a blog post that you would put on a website. Again, discussing in more detail something that we've covered in class, or something that's tied to the material we covered in class. So again, that's the other your major course assignments in terms of getting a grade. The last of these is the reaction papers. I will give you a number of videos. Some of them are really good in this class. I want you to watch them when they're assigned, because they're tied to what we're covering at that point in time. It doesn't do a hell of a lot of good if you wait and watch the videos at the end of the semester, for example, the deal with Melanesian societies that we covered in early February, and you suddenly decide that you're going to watch them in May, or April. It's like, why? By then you will have, your ability to tie them in with the material is gone already. They just become make work. None of the videos, with the exception of one, are really long, and the really long one is creepy, surrealistically good. So most of them are short. They're all professionally done. And what I'm going to give you is, when you watch the videos, I will have a set of questions that I've given you in advance. So when you watch the video, read the questions first, watch the video, and then respond to the questions based on what you saw in the video. And that's what you get graded on. You don't get graded on the length of the answer. But if you just give me really, or I watched the video, that's not a reaction. So you're not going to get full credit for it. So don't write yourself a 20-page essay. To be honest, I don't want to read it. If it gets you that agitated, you really could write 20 pages and make that into one of your critical thinking assignments. Why not? What the heck? Obviously, it's motivating you. Attendance. In the initial part of the semester, we're going to be Zoom only. If you can't make the Zoom sessions, I always record the Zoom sessions and then post them so that you can access them in Panopto in Canvas. So you've got them that way. But I do expect you to be engaged to get the work done on time. If you're not engaged, if you're not, posting opinions on stuff, or asking questions, or getting stuff done on time, then you're going to find that part of your grade's going to sort of disappear. And of course, this is one of the really difficult things, of course, is that at least initially are going to be online. And to be honest, in my view, I don't think we're going to actually be physically in a classroom till probably April. In that context, it, as you well know from last semester, is it puts an enormous onus on you to stay on a schedule, because you're not, you don't have that. I mean, we will have the Zoom session, so you have the, when this class is, which is what, 10, 30 minute Wednesday, Friday. So we'll have a Zoom session at that time, every class. But it's much harder to stay up, and if you're not physically having to come to Chaminade and to come up to the classroom and stand there and look not bored and whatever else you got to do. You're going to do this at home or wherever. So it's a lot harder, as you well know. So hopefully last semester was sort of a learning curve on how to do this. So this semester, you know, so you got to grab yourself by the back of the neck and sort of get a grip and say, okay, do this on schedule. Okay, so let's segue here. Okay, here you see the modules. That's how it's set up in Canvas. So there's the different modules, and we go through these. This is what we're going to be talking about in these different periods of time. And this is what I want you to have looked at. The modules all have PowerPoints attached to them that you can go through in advance. That's going to be the basis of what I'm going to talk about in the Zoom sessions. But I want you to look at them in advance, because if you've got a question and I don't cover it, that's a really easy way to ask a question. You have to remember, you're paying for this class. I don't know if you're paying for it now, or if you're on a loan, you're going to pay for it, but someone paid for this class. And if you don't get the stuff out of the class, you're not getting your money's worth. Yeah, you can get a grade, but to be honest, that's a really lame argument, and you got to really think about getting what you pay to go to classes. That's a really dumb way to give out a huge chunk of money for something. There's other ways to get the same result. So if you're going to be in class, then look at the modules in advance, go over them, follow through. You know, I'll have them up just like I do now. And as you're doing that, you know, you have to be mentally engaged and say, well, you know, wait, I don't understand. You know, what does that mean? Why did this guy say that? Are you sure you got that right? And if you're, for example, if you're Tongan and we're talking about Tongan, you say, you know, Borner, I don't think that's right. You know, what I learned was different. That's fine. Everyone else is going to be a lot more interested if you've got something to say versus just listening to me like this thing. So in large part, I consider that to be part of your obligation to the class. Both if you're listening, it means you're more mentally engaged and the stuff will go through more quickly and you'll remember more of it, you'll retain more of it, which means you're getting your money's worth. Also, if you're more engaged, you're more liable to make noise about stuff. I don't care whether it's verbally, if you want to use chat or whatever, but the more you have input, the more that your colleagues are going to be interested in what's going on, because it's not just listening to a Bordner-based monologue, but it's actually more of a discussion. And that's what I want to have in these classes. I want us to have discussions about the material. That's why I give you the PowerPoints in advance. That's why I would, you know, you've got to at least skim the stuff and certainly read the material before we get to it. Why? Because in that process, then you're going to have more to say. The more you say, the more I learn from you, and the more you learn from me, and the more we learn from each other. So, you know, it's sort of the classic stereotype of what they call a win-win. I'll use that in quotes. I think that's pretty much it. Oh yeah, I'm going to try to, you know, you should see this show up in a notification. I'm going to set up a Zoom session Monday and Wednesday from 12:30 to 1:30. It's going to be open to everyone in all the classes. So basically, it's going to be what you might call Zoom office hours. And I'll probably actually be in the office. I don't see why I wouldn't during those times. So if you've got anything that you want to bring up, if it's course related, not course related, doesn't have to be Chaminade related, I don't care. And you know, want to bounce it off of me, or if you want to come in as a group, that's fine. I mean, whatever. I'm just going to be doing other stuff. I'm just going to have the Zoom session up, so it's sort of like knocking on the door to show up. So you'll have that accessible above and beyond. And as I noticed, as I mentioned, when we're doing the Zoom sessions, speak up. You know, if you know, you don't have to show your picture. You can be blank screen or something like that, or you can chat. But by all means, you know, input what you have to say, because many of you are from Oceania. You're from Pacific Islands. So at some point, you've got something to say. I mean, I've studied the Pacific for a depressingly large number of years, but you know, this isn't where I was born. So, you know, my insight is that of a professional academic, you know, in large part. And that's going to be very different. Doesn't make it more real, it just means a different point of view. So remember, your point of view is valuable. And you've got, you know, something that you should have to say, even if you're not from this part of the world. You know, and I think that you'll find that this class will be really useful, because I think for most folks, it's a very different way to look at either a place they're not familiar with, if you're not from one of the oceanic societies, or if you're from an oceanic society, it's a very, very different way to look at something that you're so comfortable with, but maybe you don't notice it. You know, it's so normal to you that you've never actually looked at it sort of an analytical way. And that's what the class is. So I think you'll find the class interesting. It's got some really great videos. And I think the material we cover is really interesting. Of course, a lot of it's really critical, because in some way, shape, or form, if you're going to stay here, you're living in Oceania, and you're going to be dealing with folks from this region, and these issues are not going away. If anything, they're getting more accelerated. So with that, I guess we'll call a halt to this proceeding. I'll try to send this out to you before the actual class start this Monday next week.